Okay, we're back. Another solo episode. Today, I want to start by talking about what's called gap instinct. Gap instinct is the human tendency to dichotomize, to split things into two categories, good or bad, good or evil, black or white. We split things into two. And when we do so, we inherently miss the gap in the middle, in which there is often a lot of value, but B, often the truth lies somewhere in there as well. This whole idea of gap instinct is often utilized by things like the media, by things like, governmental pressure in terms of creating polarization, left and right, all of that jazz. We're not going to look in such a political realm, though. We're going to look at this today in the idea of technique, which is that there's good or bad technique. Oftentimes we see things as, okay, here is an ideal of technique that I'm going to move my client towards. And now this exists for all coaches, whether or not they believe it. So for example, if you're one of these coaches or these coaches that talk about things like, technique needs to be individualized, perfectly understandable, but we have to unpack this to understand what we're actually saying and see if it's the truth. And so where people tend to go awry with this is that they say they're focusing on the individual, which would suggest that there's no such thing as a technical ideal. And so if there's allowed to be inconsistencies or breakdowns or ranges in technique, with that said, there's nothing ever to fix. So let me give you an example of this. If you believe that there's a certain degree of backgrounding or knee cave that's allowed in a deadlift or a squat, the question is how much is okay? Because if you take that to the extreme, a completely rounded over back, or knees completely falling in and touching, or add to the mix, this particular movement is creating pain, then you have to move somewhere else. Now that would suggest that there is a gold standard, there is an ideal in your head, and all coaches abide by this. Let me give you another example to further illustrate the point. If I gave a coach 10 clients and told them to teach them how to squat or bench press or deadlift, whatever it is, they'd probably have a bunch of different approaches to certain aspects, but breathing and bracing is typically, for most coaches, taught in exactly the same way across the board. So we recognize that there is some sort of ideal that exists in your head, but there is also the very relevant consideration of the fact that there is the individual. We are all different shapes and sizes. We have different athletic backgrounds. We have different considerations that need to be taken into account. And so we fall in this gap somewhere in the middle here. And there has to be the question raised then of which direction do we go? Because you as a coach have a system, or your coach has a system, there's also the individual consideration. So do we move the individual towards the system, or do we move the system to cater for the individual? Now, most coaches will do the latter. They'll take their system and allow for compromise to satisfy for the individual. The problem with this is that it creates inconsistencies within the system. If there's inconsistencies in that systematic approach, there has to be inconsistent results. And that's often what happens. What happens is that someone can solve certain problems until they can't. They can solve 9 out of 10 problems, or they can fix 9 out of 10 people, but the 10th one, it's just like, they just don't get it. They're not coordinated enough. They're not built for this. They weren't made to do this. I like to look at it a little bit different. The reality that we have to take into account here is that we are all the same. We're all the same animal doing the same movements. So even though we are all built differently to each other, I don't know why I said that, it's so weird. Even though we're all different shapes and sizes, we're all built different to each other, we're all the same animal, and we're all doing squat, bench press, and deadlift. Within those lifts, then there are certain biomechanical rules that apply to everyone. Once you can become very clear on what those biomechanical rules are, solving problems becomes really easy. What you start to learn is there's only a few breakdowns that happen on each lift. Really, there's only 3 or 4 breakdowns that happen on any lift. They just look different, in scale. So knees caving in the tiniest bit looks very different to knees caving in all the way. Or they look different on different people. So someone standing wide, that'll look different to someone standing narrow. Someone who's really big will look different to someone who's really long and lanky. Once we can recognize this, we can start to solve problems far more effectively. The way I like to look at this, the analogy I like to use, is how a physiotherapist would approach a problem with a client. If I bust up my shoulder and go to the physio, they don't have to take a photo, an x-ray, an MRI, CT scan, send it away, get a perfect model made of my shoulder, send it back, pull out my shoulder and say, hey, Thomas, this is what you've done. This is how we're going to fix it. No, they just reach under the desk. They pull out a model of a shoulder. They say, Thomas, you're a human. You have a shoulder. This is how a shoulder generally works. This is what you've done to your shoulder. And here are the general protocols for fixing that issue. If we can approach lifting technique like that, if we can recognize that we want the shoulders to operate in a certain way, the hips, the torso, every part of the body to operate in a certain way, and bring it back down to the root cause of every issue that exists in lifting, of which there typically are only 3, then we can solve these problems. We can create a global cueing system by which everyone can understand what we're trying to teach them. We can unlock patterns of recognition in terms of what's breaking down, where it's breaking down, and how that will then affect things at the top end. We can create a predictive system. We know what's going to happen to a large degree once we see this over and over and over and build that relevant experience. Now, of course, I make this a lot easier said than it is done in practice. And regardless of whether you buy into my system and what I teach or what Xero does, you have this as a coach. You have this built in inherently. And so you need to consistently look back at your system and question whether it's truly addressing the things you believe it's addressing. Question whether it's robust enough to tackle every problem. And if you find yourself consistently having to tweak your system for the individual, it's not an individual issue, it's a systematic issue. And you need to be taking stock of those changes that you make so you can dig deeper and deeper towards the root cause so you can understand what's actually going on and solve for that. That'll not only help you solve those problems when they arise, that'll give you a predictive approach where you can prevent those problems from arising in the first place. Once you do that, lifting becomes incredibly simple. This is the hard thing with coaching in general, is that we're not taught any of this. There's nothing out there that says this is a squat, this is a bench press, this is a deadlift, this is how human movement works when applied to these movements. It's literally everyone's opinion made up, created based on their experience. And when you build a whole library of anecdotal experience for long enough, you eventually become more and more closed-minded. And so you look for things to solve within your closed-minded view of what's existing. And so I understand this deeply because I've been guilty of this. I've been very closed-minded in the past of what's right and wrong. And when I've sought further education or further mentoring, I've been forced to change my system. And that can be a hard pill to swallow. Now, again, I'm not saying that my system is right because it's something that I've made up along the way. Just like every other coach, just like every other expert in this field. What you have to rely on as a coach, which is what I rely on as a coach, is your system producing a consistent result? Is there consistent failures in your system? If there are, what are those failures and what do you need to change about your system to fix them? So this isn't a message of saying my way's the right way, everyone's wrong. This is a message of saying we as coaches need to consistently reevaluate our system to make it better, to make it more robust, to make it be able to solve any client's issues so that we can continue to solve client issues, so that we can continue to get better as coaches, build better businesses, but more than anything, give the client the best experience possible. Hope that helped. Let me know if you've got any questions about it. Always happy to talk about this stuff. Give me topic suggestions because I love talking about these things on these solo podcasts, and I'll see you next time.